in the United States, all over the country. And they dedicate themselves to performing popular music. But what I want you to understand before you leave today is popular music evolves. Popular music changes. The idea that Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven and Handel are old classical composers is actually untrue. In their time, they were popular musicians. Everybody was excited to hear the new Mozart piano concerto. Everyone was excited to hear the new Haydn symphony or the new Handel overture. Everyone wanted to hear these composers' works because they were popular musicians. So I love to retort people when they ask me, well, do you play any popular music? I say, yes, that's all that we play. Everything we play was popular at some time. So I want you to see that popular music has a lot of different contexts. Now, a few seasons ago, we started dedicating our Pops concerts to specific themes or genres. We first started with dance music, and we celebrated all this wonderful dance music. We did a opera concert where we celebrated great music from operas. Last year, we did great music in film, and we had the opportunity to experience a ton of different film scores from throughout the century and previously. And so today, we are celebrating Broadway. This whole Palms concert is dedicated to Broadway. And I want to set you up for the music that we're going to hear because Broadway is really special in terms of American music history. So brace yourself. This is the history lesson. But I'm going to make it as energizing and energetic as possible. Okay? You're not allowed to fall asleep yet. Actually, you're not allowed to fall asleep at all. Because I promise what you're going to hear and experience is really exciting. The reason I say that Broadway is unique and special in terms of American music history is America didn't have a musical identity at the turn of the century. This was a really weird place to be. This is right after the Industrial Revolution, right at the turn of the century. We're preparing for the horrible battle that is the Civil War, and then dealing with Reconstruction. We have all of these issues of economy and infrastructure that the country's still trying to get its feet established on. So if you can imagine, there wasn't a lot of time in the Northeast for people to just hang out and write music. People were busy farming, building businesses, building relationships, building families, welcoming families from overseas. It was a really tumultuous time in America's history, and music was one of the last things to really mature. Broadway became an answer to a lot of people's questions of what is American music, and how do we identify ourselves in music as Americans. A lot of the musicals that we're going to reference today have these very blatant patriotic undertones. They come from a time when America was trying to establish its identity, and it was competing against European traditions. Now, as an orchestra director, I can tell you this is basically all I deal with is European traditions, right? Most of the music that orchestras perform now, the greatest hits, if you will, are a bunch of old, dead, white European men. That's basically what dominates the orchestral literature. And I tell you, it really is sad because there were so many other people writing music throughout history. But these were the composers that were heralded as the best and as the greatest because they had the most money and the most support. This is something we still struggle with in the 21st century. The people that have the most money and the most support are the people that are usually remembered. And there's all of this music from time gone by that really represents what America was all about and still resonates with generations today. So I want to expose you to some of that with this music. And we're going to begin, although you have my permission to roll your eyes real quick, we're going to begin with a bit of a cliche. We're going to start with, "Let me entertain you." It's a little eye roll, not a big one. Although it might seem a little cliche, I want to make sure you know the context. And so everybody's got to do this with me. I want you to say context.
Context.
So the context is important. What I mean by context is where is this coming from? Not just the musical, but the story of the musical. Now, I don't want to waste our time going through a full synopsis of all the musicals we listen to because we have a ton of music to get through. But I do want to tell you important things about the pieces that we chose for today's concert. "Let Me Entertain You" comes from a musical called Gypsy. How many people are familiar with this musical? Okay, good. So for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's an absolutely phenomenal show. It was actually redone in 1993 with Bette Midler playing Mama. Wonderful adaptation for the movies. And what's unique about this is it tells you the story of a mother trying to raise two young vaudeville stars. But this is in the late 30s. So vaudeville was being ushered out. It was dying away. And Broadway was taking over. And this mother is stuck in a world that she knows of entertainment that was led by vaudeville. And now her daughters are growing up in a world without vaudeville. And how does she bridge this gap? What is she supposed to do for her young girls to become successful stars? Now, as you can imagine, trying to raise 2 young children to be superstars can cause some problems. Justin Bieber, just saying. Just putting it out there. Right, so this creates some issues for them, and I won't give it all away, right? No spoiler alerts. I want you to see the musical if you haven't seen it. But the mother is struggling throughout to try to get her girls to be successful. And she's a bit neurotic. That's putting it quite lightly. One of the songs that her young girl performs is Let Me Entertain You. And she has blonde, curly locks, and she wears this little Betty Boop style dress, and she looks like Heidi throughout most of the musical, and she's singing Let Me Entertain You to all of these wonderful crowds. Well, about halfway through the musical, someone finally confronts the mother and lets her know, look, vaudeville is dead, and you're trying to sell this dead art form. Nobody wants to see vaudeville anymore. Everybody's into Broadway. Everybody wants Broadway, and they want burlesque. And the mother's really shaken by this. It doesn't make any sense to her, and she's not going to have her girls do that. And then literally in abject poverty, she recognizes that she has only one choice. So she decides to have her young daughter perform Let Me Entertain You as a burlesque act. And halfway through this musical, the tides turn. Suddenly we're confronted with the strife of an artist trying to make it, trying to remain popular, trying to keep up with the times, the idea of censorship and what's popular and what people will pay for. And this wonderful tune that's been sung by this little girl the entire musical is suddenly sung by a young woman and means something very different. So although this is rather serious, I wanted to set you up for the context. A lot of the things that we've been caught humming or whistling or singing have these incredibly rich political and socio-political histories. And it's something I think we can still learn from today. In this arrangement, you're going to hear the transformation of Let Me Entertain You, from this cheeky, wonderful little tune that this little girl sings to this wonderfully rich and exotic burlesque tune. I think you'll hear it immediately when the changes happen. I know you're going to enjoy it. Are you guys ready to celebrate Broadway with the Smart Orchestra?
Yeah!
Let's give it a round of applause. Cover a lot of ground really fast because we're going to reference a couple different tunes with these next two selections. The first, Give My Regards to Broadway, starts off this arrangement. How many people know this tune? Nice. How many people know that this comes from a desperately, blatantly patriotic Broadway show? Ah, less hands. Interesting.
Yes.
So this comes from a show that's written at the turn of the century. And that's kind of an interesting place. It's Little Johnny Jones. And it's about a jockey, someone that races horses, who decides he's going to travel over to England to race a horse. right, and hopefully spread his career and gain some fame in Europe. He goes over to Europe, and as you can imagine, a series of unfortunate events take place. Someone tries to frame him in a gambling scheme, and a lot of things go bad. And towards the second act, he's stuck in England because he's caught up in all of this gambling fiasco, and he has to say goodbye to all of his friends who are returning to America. So now stuck in England, this jockey tells all of his friends when they return to America to give his regards to Broadway and remember him when they visit Herald Square. And this is about him reminiscing over the fact that he can't go back home. And he wants to remember all the wonderful places that he had an experience to visit and to live in and experience. So it really is about this remorse of not being able to return to America after being away. Most people probably know this as some sort of a swan song, right? There have been some absolutely phenomenal, legendary Broadway stars that have used this as an opportunity to reminisce the end of a career or leaving a production. But this is really about not being able to go home to America. And when you hear it in that context, I think it changes a lot of the meanings. So again, it's about context. Everybody say context.
Context.
Context. Everybody say context.
Context.
Right? Where is the music coming from and what do those words mean? So when we're thinking about being homesick and we're thinking about where it is that we've been, we're going to come straight back to America pretty quickly with Ain't Misbehavin'. How many people know this tune? Ain't Misbehavin'. How many people know who wrote that tune? It wasn't Gershwin. Who did it? Fats Waller. Absolutely legendary African-American jazz musician and pianist known for ragtime. Fats Waller wrote this tune. Now here's the thing. A lot of people have probably sung this tune and thought it was a little cheeky. I want you to know it's quite cheeky because it was written in prison. Fats was serving time in prison, and he literally started writing this tune because he was not misbehaving and trying to earn good time so he could get released early. When he got out of prison, he started playing this tune, and it caught the ear of a few other musicians, and they decided to create a musical that would encapsulate the experience of African-American musicians in Tin Pan Alley and on Broadway in New York at the turn of the 20th century. It was an incredible success, and people suddenly recognized Fats Waller not only as a great jazz musician, but a great composer, a true musician at heart to be able to perform and sing and write great music. So this was a huge milestone for African-American musicians in the Northeast at the turn of the 20th century. And the music itself gave people this idea of what it was like to be black and be performing in New York at the time. When you know that, I think you recognize Ain't Misbehavin' has a lot of other meanings, because you could be really beat up, you could be caught, you could be attacked because you were black in an all-white city, and an all-white government, and an all-white police force. Ain't Misbehavin' had some really interesting contexts in that time. Now, if you still remember it, seeing it, on Broadway or seeing it in context of a show of someone, again, trying to be a little cheeky, you can still have that memory, but I want to shake you a little bit for you to know that the contexts are so much richer. And Fats Waller gives this incredible anthem to what black musicians were going through at the turn of the 20th century. So from that, we're going to jump over to Babes in Arms, one of my favorite songs, My Funny Valentine. How many people know this? Absolutely amazing tune. This was something I actually sang to my wife early on when we were dating. But I was remiss to find something out important about how this shows up in the musical. So Babes in Arms is the musical it shows up in. How many people have heard this crooned by a very sultry voice that is male? How many have heard My Funny Valentine sung by a man? So this is how I experienced first. Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, I heard it as one of the great jazz ballads of the 20th century. In the musical, it's sung by a woman. And this was meant to be sung by a woman to a man. Now, when I read it first, I thought, that can't be right. And I sing it to my wife all the time, and this makes me feel kind of weird. And then I thought about the lyrics, and I realized, you know what? If I was really telling my wife that her looks were laughable, I don't think it would go over well. But somehow there's sort of this reverse stereotype that if a girl said that to me, I'd just kind of be like, So I think it does work a little better if a girl is singing this to a guy. But the idea is that she's reminiscing over the fact that, right, you might not be the best looking. If you think about it, your looks are not, right, this Greek god. You're not really rich. You're not, but your heart makes me smile. right? There's this idea that in spite of all these things that might not be socially acceptable, I still love you. And so there's this great message that comes out through My Funny Valentine, that you don't fit what everybody else thinks is right, but you're just right for me. So it really uplifts the spirit and gives this hope to the audience as they experience it. There are two more tunes in this medley that I think you appreciate and that I'm sure you probably know. I've Grown Accustomed to Her Face. People know this tune from My Fair Lady. Anybody seen My Fair Lady?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So this is originally based off of Pygmalion. Everybody's familiar with the story. And what's interesting about this is Rex Harrison, who does the film adaptation, who I don't think actually ever sang a note in his life. He just spoke everything to everybody in a gruff voice. He sings this at the very, very end, and he recognizes that he's fallen in love with this young, poor girl that he's been trying to help in elocution lessons, the whole musical, or throughout the whole film, however you experienced it first. And what's interesting is the lyrics are a bit contrived. I've grown accustomed to her face, and he refuses to admit that he's fallen in love with her. Now, I have to admit something, though. I saw the Rex Harrison film first. That's how I experienced it. And I really hate the ending of the musical and the ending of the movie. I'm just being totally honest with everybody. So, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it, the very last line of the whole thing is, "Where are my slippers?" It's the last thing he says. And I always hated it because throughout the whole musical, it's about this conversation of the wealthy and the educated versus the poor and the ignorant. The whole thing is set up to address these social clashes. And throughout it, you recognize that the poor are not necessarily ignorant. They just don't have money. And that the wealthy are not necessarily educated. In fact, they become quite pompous. And by the end of it, you slowly see the roles change. The young girl's father suddenly comes into wealth by tricking an American to believe that he's a moral expert, which shows that Americans are kind of dumb, which never really made sense to me, because that's not necessarily true. And then it goes throughout. She suddenly is able to speak well, and she's confused with the princess of an Eastern European country. And all of these roles change, but then all of a sudden, you get this last scene where she comes back to admit that she's madly in love with him, she can't live without him. And the last thing he says to her is, "Where are my slippers?" Never quite sat right with me. But we at least know that he's grown accustomed to her face, which I guess is about as sentimental as Rex Harrison or any other character could be at that time. So lastly, you're going to hear "Thou Swell." Anybody familiar with this? "Thou Swell." So this comes from a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. So it's a lesser-known musical, one you might not be familiar with, but what's interesting about this is the juxtaposition of modern and old. And I think that's what this entire arrangement allows you to do. So you're going to see the juxtaposition of old and new. I want you to know the context of these songs, but I want you to hear them in context of today and the things that still resonate with us. You guys ready for some more music?
Yeah.
Yes.
Welcome your smart orchestra.
Woo!
say context.
Context!
There you go. Aren't these songs different? It's insane to me. I love that I have the opportunity as a conductor to dive into this music and recognize that it wasn't written last week, right? Some of this music is centuries old. Some of it has roots into American patriotism that goes all the way back into the 18th century of us hearing these songs and these melodies and these ideas. I want to continue that journey with you, and so I'm going to diminish a little bit of the speaking because I think I've got everybody's attention now. I think you're hearing the context. So I want to give you some highlights of the things that we have coming up. So the next tune, Bright Lights of Broadway, we're going to talk about one of my favorite composers, not just Broadway composers, but one of my favorite composers and lyricists, Stephen Sondheim. Any Sondheim fans? I absolutely love Sondheim. I love everything that he had an opportunity to do, not just as a lyricist, but as a composer. He's written absolutely incredible works for the American ballad and for the American Broadway stage, and in theater in general. He's had a huge impact on American music. So this next tune is going to feature 3 songs. 3 that I think, again, you're probably familiar with, but one that I want you to have a little bit of context of. The first is Another Opening, Another Show. How many people know this? Really popular Broadway tune. All right, just as famous as Give My Regards to Broadway. And so this comes directly from Kiss Me Kate, and this is about a troupe of actors that are getting ready for another show. And it's setting up the context of what the performer's life is like, very much like Gypsy. They fall in that same vein of breaking that fourth wall and giving you a look at what the performer goes through in their life and their struggle to create art. So we start with Another Open and Another Show, and then we're going to transition to Send in the Clowns. You'll know this tune, Send in the Clowns. So this comes from a very, very famous musical by Sondheim. Some people actually consider this one of his operettas or his operas. This is a little night music. Very challenging music to sing and perform. A very difficult show to put together because of how rich the context is, again, in history and what the performers are trying to do. But I want to spend a little time explaining this. So a lot of people make the assumption, and Sondheim went on record in interviews saying that he was really upset about this. The clowns that he's referring to have nothing to do with a circus. So a lot of people create some sort of connection between, send in the clowns means to send in, Bozo with a big red nose and like fluffy orange hair. And this isn't his point at all. Sondheim, who is, deeply entrenched in the idea of the theater world and the Broadway scene in New York at the turn of the century, he's referencing what becomes a theater slogan, and which anybody that's worked in theater probably knows. If you're doing a vaudeville act, if you're doing a Broadway show, if you're in the midst of the show, and the energy starts to wane, or someone drops a line, or you feel like you're losing the crowd, you send in the clowns. You send in comedians. You send in people to make jokes, to try to get everybody revved up again, so that you don't lose them. So the idea of the song is a theater phrase, to send in the fools, to send in the comedians. Now, he went in an interview and admitted, I could have very well called it Send in the Fools, but that just doesn't sound the same. So the idea is to send in people to make light of whatever the situation is. Now here's the context. We're going to do something different. Everybody say context. This one's a little more serious. So in the scene that this song appears, it's in the second act, and our leading lady, who was being courted by a young man at the beginning of the show and gave him up early in her life, is confronted with him again in her life. He returns to say hello, and she recognizes immediately that she had always been in love with him and that she wants to spend the rest of her life with him. And thinking that he's returned to exchange the same sentiment, she admits, I've been in love with you all this time, and I can't believe I've lived this long without you, and I want to be with you forever. And he goes, oh, that's so nice. Thanks. He doesn't know how to react because he's newly engaged. Now, what's weird is in the musical, he's engaged to an 18-year-old. He's not 18. That's what you need to know. He's not 18. And she immediately thinks, okay, it's some kind of trick. She's doing it for the money, and she tries to convince him, this isn't a real marriage. You don't love her. You need to be with me. And he says, look, I am going to be faithful to my fiancée. This is a woman I've fallen in love with, and you had your chance for all this. Depending on what adaptation you saw, there's this wonderful moment where this all happens in her bedroom, and she sits down on one end of the bed, and he circles her and sits on the opposite end, so their backs are facing each other. And she began to sing, Send in the Clowns, because she recognizes, I've made an error. I've made this horrible mistake. I'm losing the crowd. Send in the clowns, send in the jokesters, send in the comedians, let make this lighthearted, but they don't come. And Sondheim uses this as this wonderful moment to speak to the audience and say, what are the opportunities that you've lost? What are the opportunities that you might still be able to take advantage of? Don't lose them, because when you call for the comedians to make light of a devastating situation, they're not there for you. And it's this wonderful moment where they realize that. Now, spoiler alert again, so that we don't bring everybody down too much. I don't have any comedians I can call in here. It's just me. But I'll let you know. They do end up getting together, and as twisted as this sounds, his fiancée runs off with another man, his son, who is closer to 18 than he is. So it works out because she leaves him and he gets to be with the leading lady. So by the end, it all works out. But it's this wonderfully sincere moment right in the middle of the musical. So we're going to hear that right in the center, and I think you'll really enjoy it. And then, of course, we're going to finish with Comedy Tonight. So a funny thing happens on the way to the Forum, another wonderful Sondheim musical. This is set up to be incredibly farcical, a comedy that is set in ancient Greece, and it's done with an incredible amount of wit and intellect. Sondheim is known for this in the dialogue that he writes and the music that he creates, and I think it'll pep us right back up. It'll basically be our comedians that we're calling for. The clowns come in at the end to save us. You guys ready for some more music?
Woo!